Okay. Rodney asked this question. I know the Bible talks a lot about God's provision for believers, but I'm wondering if you could point to any verses that talk about God's provision for the church. And here's his point. He goes, it seems like some churches are always talking about the financial needs of the church to the congregation, and it seems like it's the congregation they're trusting in rather than the Lord. Are there any scriptures that address the needs of the body?
You know what, I got that question probably about an hour ago. That's a really good question. I've never ever thought of it in terms like that. Because when I look at passages in the Bible and they talk about God's provision for us, it's almost always talking about God's provision for individuals. Mm-hmm. And so I went through real quick and I had to go through and study that out. And I haven't done it exhaustively, Rodney, but I didn't find a passage that talked about God's provision for the church in the sense of, like what we have as churches. So here at Calvary, we have a campus. We got 13 acres with buildings on it and that kind of stuff. And really the reason that you wouldn't have that in the New Testament is because that's not how the churches were. So they didn't have buildings. What they had was houses that they met in. And so usually a church would meet in the house of somebody who had a large courtyard or a large area where they could fellowship. So there was no need for a building. But there are verses that talk about giving to the church. And so, in Acts chapter 2, at the end of the chapter, you have a passage where it talks about God moved on the hearts of the people, and that they were daily with one accord in the temple, breaking bread from house to house. They ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart. It talks about the fact that they shared all things in common, verse 44. All who believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and divided them among them all as anyone had need. Now, it was a special situation because it was during Pentecost, and you'd have a bunch of people who were from outside of town in Jerusalem. Pentecost was one of the feasts that all the Jews who were 20 years and older, all the men, had to attend once a year. And so if you got saved in Jerusalem and you wanted to hang out at the church at Jerusalem, most likely you didn't have a lot of funds to be able to do that. So they were taking care of people. Later on at the end of chapter 4, you see some of the same stuff. It says, now the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and one soul, verse 32. Neither did anyone say that any of the things he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. And with great power the apostles gave witness to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. Nor was there anyone among them who lacked, for all who were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the proceeds of the things that were sold, and laid them at the apostles' feet, and they distributed to each as anyone had need. And it goes on and talks about specifically Barnabas's offering. In chapter 5, you have an issue with that, with Ananias and Sapphira who lie about their giving. And so what you see in the book of Acts is the example of people who were giving sacrificially to the Lord to meet the needs of the fellowship. And in this case, a lot of the needs of the fellowship there were a bunch of poor people there who needed to be taken care of. And again, so you see that. The way it worked was God moved on the hearts of the people. That's the way it worked in the passage. You don't have a passage where it says that Peter got up and did an appeal for funds or anything like that. And Rodney, I agree with you. I don't like it when I didn't grow up in church, and so when I would watch TV and run across Christian TV and that kind of stuff, it was the one thing that you could be absolutely sure of is that some dude was going to stand up there begging on TV for people to give money, and that's what I thought Christians were all about. All they ever do is beg for money, and it's not attractive. It doesn't look good. Paul the Apostle, give you a couple other things. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9, Paul talks about giving and the fact that, again, that we need to give sacrificially. But in that context, a lot of times churches go to that passage to excuse standing up and telling people that they need to give to, our mission or to our church or that kind of stuff. What you have in that passage is Paul talking to the churches in Greece, specifically in that case, Corinth, about giving not to him, but to the church at Jerusalem, which was undergoing some persecution and some problems because of a famine that was taking place. So, in other words, Paul was standing up in front of this congregation saying, you need to give to these guys over here because they're having a real problem. And so you see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. He talks about making sure that, talks to them about making sure that when they're doing an offering, that they, actually, you know what? That's wrong. 1 Corinthians 16 is just about giving. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, he talks about doing the offering, making sure that they collect it before he gets there so that there wouldn't be any embarrassment. And or any of him going around going, hey, you promised last year you were going to do this, and why aren't you coming up with the money? Over in Philippians chapter 4, let me read this passage to you. Paul is talking about the issue of giving, specifically to him, and what he's doing is he's thanking the Philippians for the things that they've done for him. And he says this, I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at last your care for me has flourished again, though you surely did care, but you lacked opportunity. And what he's saying is that he received a gift from them. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, I know how to abound everywhere, and in all things I've learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Nevertheless, you've done well that you shared my distress. Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only. For even in Thessalonica you sent once and again for my necessities. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your account. Indeed, I have all and abound. I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the things sent from you, a sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. And so he is thanking them for the offering that he gave. But in that passage, you find out that the only church that was really supporting Paul while he was in Macedonia was the church at Philippi. He wasn't getting funds from anybody else, and he didn't solicit funds. You see the same thing in 1 Corinthians 9. Paul goes through and he talks about the fact that apostles have the right to have a believing wife. They have the right to expect to have their expenses paid, specifically by the church. Let me read a passage to you out of that. It says, whoever goes to war at his own expense, verse 7 of chapter 9. Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit? Or who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock? Do I say these things as a mere man? Or does not the law say the same also? For it's written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned about? Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but endure all things, lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar? And he's talking about the priesthood in the Old Testament. Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. But I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things that it should be done so to me, for it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void. And what he's telling the Corinthians is, I don't want your money. But this is how God has designed the whole thing. And so you see in that passage, the whole principle of tithing in the Old Testament is brought forward into the New Testament. You have the same kind of principle. The reason that the tithe was used in the law was to take care of the priests and to take care of the temple and to take care of the ministry. And so you have that same principle brought forward in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. It's real clear in Scripture. And so you have all that. But when you look at what God has, what the Bible has to say about Christians and giving, it's always God working on the heart of individual believers to have them have a giving heart, and not a matter of commandment in the sense of law. Me coming up and saying, writing people a letter and saying you need to give 10% or something like that. There's a passage in Psalm 37, I think it's verse 25. It says, David's speaking, and it says, I've been young and now I'm old, and I have yet to see the righteous forsaken, or his seed begging for bread. And when I see somebody begging, that's what I think of. God is the one who provides for us, and so I do not like the whole begging thing in Christianity. In fact, people at my church don't. I don't tell people our needs at our fellowship, and those things get out every once in a while. People will find out that we're doing something, but I don't ever stand up front and say we have a need here at Calvary Chapel, and can you come and meet the need? Or I don't do thermometers and that kind of thing, because again, it's not attractive. And one of the things that you mentioned in your letter is that it seems like the church is depending on the people instead of the Lord, and I never want to be in that position. I want to depend on the Lord. And so Chuck Smith is kind of a mentor to every Calvary Chapel pastor, and he had lots of sayings, and one of them was, where God guides, God provides. Mm-hmm. And so I've seen that always to be the case. And so that's what I'm looking for. I'm satisfied with what God provides with, like Paul said in Philippians chapter 4. And if he wants more, then he'll move on it. In fact, actually in my church, I have to watch the things that I say, because a lot of times people will do things for me depending on what I say in a Bible study. Was it last week that I was talking about
the game?
Yeah, the game.
Mm-hmm.
I was goofing. Yeah, I'm giving illustrations, and I'm talking about stuff that I wanted when I was a kid, and one of them was a game called Mousetrap. And so I'm using this illustration of Mousetrap and that kind of thing. The other day, day before yesterday, my receptionist comes in and she goes, "Steve, you got a package." And I opened the package. In fact, she mocked me, because she's like, "You had a package sent to yourself and you put on it Pastor Steve Winery?" And so she was mocking me about it. I go, "I don't know where the package came from." I open it up and it's Mousetrap. Somebody had bought Mousetrap and had it sent to me. And so I have to watch the things I say when I teach, because people will just do things for me, and I really appreciate that. But
right.
Yeah, that's a cool thing. Now, having said all that, I think Christians need to be giving. Need to be giving, man. Jesus uses the church to share the gospel. We're all supposed to be individually sharing the gospel, but one of the things that Jesus set up was the church. And so we need to be people who are giving to the work of God. If you're getting fed at a local fellowship, then you need to be supporting the local fellowship. That's the way it's supposed to go. I have different places that I give, and so I give to Compassion, I give to missionaries, and I'm not going to tell you all the places I give, but I give to a lot of things, and I give to my church too. And I've always had the principle that I'm going to give a certain percentage to the fellowship that I go to, because that's where God's placed me. That's where the work of God in my life has taken place, and it needs to be supported. And you don't support the church, what's going to end up happening is it's not going to be able to do the mission that it's given. Guys, my mother-in-law one time was totally offended because the local church that they were going to sent out letters saying, "We know the median income of our town, and we know approximately how much each family should be giving, and your giving is lower than it should be according to the median income," right? And she was all ticked off about it and called me up, and I said, "Yeah, that's not right. A right thing to do. You don't do that kind of stuff." But you know what? If every family was giving the way that the Bible talks about, the church would have plenty and more to be giving. It's like if that was going on in every fellowship in the Tri-Cities. Well, I can just tell you that in our fellowship, I keep it tight as far as the money goes. I don't like spending a lot of money on stuff, and so I keep it pretty tight. And if we had a surplus that would come from that kind of giving, it would all be going to, I mean, our buildings would be all paid off, and it would all be going to missions and spreading the gospel and that kind of stuff. That's what it would be going to, and we'd be able to do things that would be really awesome. So God's the one who provides, but we as believers need to be people who understand that we're supposed to have giving hearts.
Sure.
And so that's what I tell people.
Yeah, when God asked for that free will offering in Exodus, people were given so much, he had to stop.
Yeah. That's one of the ones that came to mind when I was thinking of that. He's talking about when they were building the tabernacle. There was a free will offering for the building of the tabernacle, and all the people brought so much that Moses had to stop and give it back to them because they had more than enough. Yeah. And so that would be a cool thing.
Yeah, it would be a cool thing. Yeah. We're giving back to you. Yeah. But at the same time, as you also mentioned, Abraham, after that battle rescuing Lot, had that conversation with Sodom, the king of Sodom.
Yeah.
And said, what does he say?
I'll
take nothing from a thread of sandal strap, that I will not take anything that's yours, lest you should say I've made Abraham rich.
Right.
And so Abraham has this attitude that it's God that provides for me, not you.
Right. Yeah.
And so good balance back and forth.